Hey everyone, this is Dark Ascent. The highest stretch of Everest has a name climbers know well, the Death Zone, and it is a lot more literal than it sounds. In today's video, this Karen let being outdone by less experienced climbers push her past the point where she should have turned back and found out proving a point only got her so far once the descent started breaking her down. It was May 17, 2021. Mount Everest straddles Nepal and Tibet, with most climbers approaching from the Nepal side through a series of high camps. Camp 4 sits near 26,000 feet at the South Col, just below the summit. It is right around that altitude where climbers start using the term death zone, and it is not dramatic language. It is just accurate. Above that point, the air holds so little oxygen that the human body cannot actually adjust to it anymore. Even with a supplemental oxygen mask strapped on, every breath still feels thin and effortful, like pulling air through a straw. The cold sitting somewhere well below zero, wind cutting across bare rock and ice with no real shelter anywhere along that stretch. It is the kind of place people keep coming back to anyway, year after year, because for a lot of climbers, this mountain is the absolute ceiling of what a human being can attempt on foot. Nancy Brixton was 57 years old. She had been climbing seriously for close to 2 decades by that point, with several major summits already behind her across different continents, high peaks in South America, in Africa, enough of a record that other climbers on the mountain that season knew her name before they ever met her in person. This was not her first time at extreme altitude, and it was not her first guided expedition either. An attempt like this one does not come cheap or easy. Permits à loan run past $10,000 per climber, and a full guided expedition, gear, staffing, weeks of logistics included, can run anywhere from $45,000 to $70,000 a person. The whole process, start to finish, takes close to 2 months, most of that time spent slowly working up and down the mountain just to get the body ready for one attempt at the top. She had done the training, she had the gear, and by every account from people who climbed with her before, she moved well up high, steady, controlled, someone other climbers respected on the mountain. Experience is useful until it starts carrying too much weight in the decision. Nancy had spent years proving to herself that she could handle hard mountains, and that history was always going to shape how she judged this one. That season, she was part of a small group of 5 or 6 climbers attempting the summit together, a loose collection of people who had crossed paths on other expeditions over the years. Not close friends exactly, but familiar faces, the sort of group that forms naturally around people who keep showing up on the same big peaks. 2 of the climbers in that group were younger, a couple attempting their first mountain at this altitude together, still finding their footing in a world Nancy had already spent years moving through. Her guide that season had close to 15 years of experience on the mountain himself, enough seasons behind him that other guides and expedition leaders trusted his judgment when it came to a client's condition or pace. That mattered later, since it explains why his read on Nancy carried real weight when he needed to relay something up the chain. Getting to base camp itself takes over a week just from Kathmandu, flying into a small mountain airstrip, then trekking for days through increasingly thin air before the expedition even really begins. Once there, base camp becomes something closer to a small, temporary village than a campsite, dozens of tents scattered across the ice and rock, a large dining tent at the center where meals are prepared daily. Satellite phones set up for calling home, doctors moving between tents checking oxygen levels, and resting heart rates on climbers between rotations. Between rotations, there is a strange, restless kind of downtime. Card games, books, long conversations that circle the same handful of topics, weather forecasts, route conditions, who is planning to go for the summit on which day. Nancy spent some of that time with the younger couple in her group, by a few accounts encouraging with them early on, offering tips on pacing and gear, the sort of mentorship that experienced climbers often extend to newer ones, even while some quieter part of her was clearly tracking exactly how they were coming along. Mentoring someone and comparing yourself to them can happen at the same time. People are complicated like that. Early in the expedition, before any of the higher camps came into play, the route passes through the Khumbu Icefall, a shifting, unstable maze of towering ice blocks and deep crevasses considered one of the single most dangerous stretches on the entire mountain. The ice there moves, slowly but constantly, so climbers cross it in the early hours of the morning, sometimes even before sunrise, when the cold has it at its most solid and stable. The route through it is strung together with metal ladders lashed end to end over open crevasses, some of those gaps deep enough to swallow the beam of a headlamp without ever finding a bottom. climbers crossing one at a time in crampons, ice axe in hand, harness clipped to fixed lines the entire way across. Every climber on that mountain passes through it multiple times over the course of an expedition, and Nancy did too, several times over, without incident. During one of the later rotations, up to Camp 3, her guide noted something small that would only really seem significant afterward. Nancy had slept poorly the night before and mentioned a headache that morning, common enough at that altitude, and when he suggested she consider an extra rest day before pushing higher, she brushed it off, telling him she felt fine and would rather continue on schedule than lose a day sitting around. She completed that rotation without any real trouble, the headache easing once she was moving, which if anything only reinforced her sense that she knew her own limits better than a standard precaution did. A bad decision that ends well can be very persuasive. Suddenly it is not a bad decision anymore. It is something I have already handled. The weeks that followed were spent finishing out those acclimatization rotations, each one reaching a little higher before dropping back down to base camp to recover. Nancy moved through them well, if anything stronger than the two younger climbers in her group, which likely did nothing to soften how she saw her own position heading into summit night. During the last rotation back down from Camp 3, the younger couple reached the lower camp ahead of Nancy for the first time that season. It was not a major gap, and nobody treated it like one, but her guide later remembered Nancy asking how long they had been ahead. She did not argue about it, but she brought it up again later that evening, still trying to pin down why they had finished ahead of her. That earlier little comparison was clearly not going anywhere. If anything, this probably pushed it a little closer to the surface. By mid-May, the whole mountain was watching the same thing, a narrow window of stable weather that forecasters expected to open for only a few days before the wind returned to the summit ridge. Teams across every camp were making the same calculation. Wait any longer, and the season could close without another real chance at all. When word came down that the 17th looked like the strongest window they had seen in days, it added a weight to the day that went beyond any one climber's ambition. Turning back would not simply mean trying again tomorrow. For a lot of people on that mountain, it would mean flying home without the summit at all. That is a lot of pressure to pile onto one morning. After weeks of waiting and thousands of dollars spent, turning around can start to feel like losing more than just the summit. The hours before a summit push are mostly spent checking the same small pieces of equipment again and again. Oxygen bottles are weighed and counted. Regulators are tested. Headlamp batteries are checked. Spare gloves are tucked into packs, and every climber tries to eat and drink enough before the cold and altitude make both harder. Nothing about Nancy's gear stood out that night. The risk was never one missing item. It was the amount of time the plan could survive once the schedule started slipping. Camp 4 itself is barely a camp at all, just a flat, exposed shelf of rock at the edge of survivable altitude, tents pinned down against wind that never really stops. The air already thin enough there that simple tasks like melting snow for water take twice as long as they should. Later that evening, talk turned, as it often does before a big push, to a mountain Nancy had attempted years earlier and turned back from, short of the top, when conditions got bad. She told her guide plainly that she did not intend to be the one turning back again, not this time, not with two climbers half her experience about to stand where she had already failed to reach once before. That is a rough comparison to carry into summit night. Once the younger climbers were part of the picture, turning back was never going to feel like just turning back. It also meant watching them get the result she had wanted for years. Earlier that evening, Nancy used the team's satellite phone for a short call home, as many climbers do before a summit attempt. Her guide recalled it, lasting only a few minutes. Over quickly since reception at that altitude was unreliable and battery life was limited. That same night, during the standard safety briefing every guide gives before a summit attempt, with the whole team gathered in the thin light of a single lantern, the lead guide laid out the team's target turnaround time for the next day, along with a walkthrough of how their oxygen supply had been calculated around that schedule. The plan included a limited margin for delays, but anyone falling substantially behind would be turned around rather than allowed to keep spending that reserve on the climb up. The exact decision would depend on position, weather, pace, and remaining oxygen, but the guides made one thing clear. The summit was never worth using up the margin needed to descend safely. It is a rule that exists because of exactly what this story is about. Running out of daylight and oxygen on the way down kills more climbers on this mountain than the climb up ever does. There is actually a recognized term among mountaineers for what makes that rule so hard to follow in practice: summit fever. the well-documented tendency for climbers to fixate so completely on reaching the top that clear warning signs start to feel like obstacles rather than reasons to stop. It happens to experienced climbers as often as beginners, sometimes more, since experience can quietly convince a person that the rule was written for someone else. There is also a simpler, more physical explanation sitting underneath all of it. Oxygen deprivation to the brain, even before it produces any obvious physical symptom, is known to dull judgment and risk assessment well ahead of anything a person would notice in themselves. In a very real sense, the mountain was already working against her ability to make a clear decision long before anyone saw her stumble. That's probably one of the crueler parts of altitude. It can start taking away the exact thing you need to realize you should stop. You might still feel like you are making your own call, only with a much less reliable read on what is happening. Nancy pushed back on the turnaround time that night, telling the guide she had judged worse conditions before and trusted her own read of her body over a blanket cutoff meant for the group as a whole. The guide held the line that night, though it is worth understanding the position he was in too. A client like Nancy represented tens of thousands of dollars, paid specifically for a summit attempt, and guiding companies live and die by their success rates. Respecting that turnaround plan is the safe call, but making the final decision in real time can be harder than it sounds from the outside, especially with an experienced, capable climber pushing back with confidence rather than panic. She said she understood. Whether she accepted how narrow that margin really was became much clearer the following day. Before they left Camp 4 that night, her guide went through the same check he ran with every client, confirming her regulator, her bottle, walking through the pace they needed to hold to make the summit and get back down within the oxygen they were carrying. He reminded her plainly that the schedule did not have much room built into it. She nodded along the way clients usually do at that point, eager to just get moving. Maybe that is why turnaround times have to be decided before anyone leaves camp. Up there, you do not want to be inventing the rule at the exact moment you are most tempted to break it. Summit night began the way it always does, a departure from Camp 4 in complete darkness, somewhere close to midnight, timed so that climbers reach the top around sunrise and have as much daylight as possible for the descent. The cold at that hour is its own kind of brutal, temperatures well below zero, wind cutting through every layer of gear, no matter how well you are dressed for it. The group set out together, a long, slow line of headlamps cutting through the dark, the sound of crampons biting into ice with every step. Each climber clipped into fixed ropes, bolted into the mountain, sliding a mechanical clamp along the line as they moved, unclipping and reclipping at every anchor point along the route. Above Camp 4, the group naturally spread out, which is completely normal. Everyone moves at their own pace up there, and guides expect it. Climbers typically swap in a fresh oxygen bottle at the balcony, a small resting point partway up the ridge, where the first hint of light usually starts to show along the horizon. Nancy was moving more slowly than the schedule anticipated, while continuing to breathe supplemental oxygen at the planned flow rate. That meant she spent more time on the same cylinder before reaching each planned change point. By the balcony, she had used more of that bottle than the team expected to have consumed at that stage of the climb. Her regulator and mask were functioning normally. The problem was time. Every extra minute she spent climbing at the same oxygen flow reduced what remained before the next scheduled bottle change. What mattered was that every extra minute reduced the margin she had left for the descent. You can almost think of the oxygen like a budget, which means the more you burn getting to the summit, the less flexibility you have coming back. Higher on the southeast ridge, near the south summit and the narrow traverse beyond it, climbers from several teams had begun bunching up along the fixed line. Passing was difficult on the exposed terrain, and each group had to wait for space to open before moving through. Nancy and her guide lost close to half an hour there, standing nearly still in the cold and continuing to use oxygen without gaining much ground. It was somewhere past that point that her guide's radio picked up confirmation from another team. The two younger climbers from Nancy's own group had already passed the south summit, heading down, well ahead of schedule, safely on their way. Nancy asked, and her guide told her plainly they had made it and were already descending. Not long after, Nancy reached the team's target turnaround time, slightly behind schedule, but already high on the upper ridge. She immediately pushed to continue. Her guide radioed the lead guide with their exact position, Nancy's condition, the weather above them, and the oxygen they still had available. Because she remained responsive, was still moving under her own power, and had not yet exhausted the reserve built into the plan, the lead guide allowed only a short, defined extension. If her pace dropped further, or she failed to reach the summit within that window, she was to turn around immediately. That extension was the last margin she had. Once it was gone, there was nothing left in the plan to trade for more time. They pushed on through the upper ridge congestion and continued toward the summit. She did reach the summit that morning. Her guide's camera captured her there, a single timestamp photo that would later become one of the only fixed points anyone could use to reconstruct exactly when she had reached the top, and how far past turnaround that actually was. It came well past the point where the two younger climbers in her group had already turned around and started their own descent, both of whom made it back down safely later that day and would only learn what happened to her once they were already back at Camp 4 themselves. There was no long celebration at the top. At that height, people do not linger once the photo is taken. Nancy and her guide turned back toward the ridge almost immediately, but by then the clock, the oxygen plan, and the weather were all working from the same disadvantage. That summit photo was supposed to prove she made it. Later, it ended up proving something very different, just how late she got there. The descent is where things unraveled. Weather at extreme altitude can shift fast in the early afternoon, and that is exactly what happened. Clouds moving in below them, wind picking up hard enough to make standing upright a real effort. Visibility dropping as blowing snow filled the air. Nancy's supplemental oxygen had already been consumed for longer than planned because of her slower pace, the ridge delay, and the extra time spent climbing toward the summit. As the descent dragged on, the remaining supply began running low, well before the point the original schedule had anticipated. Parts of that ridge carry their own hidden danger, even in good conditions. Snow cornices building up along the edge, ledges that look like solid ground, but are really just unsupported snow hanging out over open air. Exactly the kind of feature climbers are trained to give a wide, deliberate distance in low visibility. The first real sign of trouble was small enough that it could have meant almost anything up there, Nancy asking to stop and rest at an anchor point where she normally would have continued on. Her guide noting it, but not yet alarmed, since brief rests are completely ordinary at that stage of a descent. It was only as that pattern kept repeating, more often and for longer each time, that it started reading as something more serious than normal fatigue. Her pace slowed considerably. A couple of climbers from other teams, already well ahead on their own descent, passed the two of them. Somewhere along that stretch, nothing more than a brief exchange of a few words in passing, already deep into managing their own exhaustion and oxygen, in no position themselves to offer more than that. You would think seeing other climbers nearby means you are less alone. At that altitude, it does not always work that way. Being close enough to help and actually having enough left to help are two very different things. Running low on oxygen at this altitude does not announce itself all at once. It shows up first as exhaustion that feels heavier than it should, then clumsiness, fingers and feet losing coordination in the cold, then confusion that can look from the outside like someone just moving strangely slow. Her guide, moving beside her the entire time, was the only person who witnessed most of what came next, and what he described was not anything he could explain with certainty, only what he could actually see happening to her. She needed more frequent stops. Then she needed physical support just to keep moving along the fixed ropes, leaning on him at each anchor point rather than managing the clips herself, a strain that started wearing on him too. His own fingers going stiff inside his gloves from handling both her gear and his own in the cold. Her responses to him grew delayed, harder to understand over the wind. Eventually, her legs simply stopped holding her, first needing him to keep her upright between steps, then not able to stay upright even with his support. Somewhere on the exposed ridge below the south summit, with no real shelter available anywhere along that stretch, she was no longer able to continue under her own power at all. There was no realistic way for one guide to carry an adult climber down that ridge. The route was too steep and too narrow. Both people were clipped to a fixed line, and even standing still for long periods was draining oxygen and heat from the guide himself. Moving her would have required several strong people, spare oxygen, daylight, and conditions stable enough for them to work. Her guide got on the radio then, trying to relay their position, through wind loud enough to swallow half of what he said, repeating himself, giving what landmarks he could to anyone listening who might be able to help. Down at Camp 4, the lead guide began organizing a high-altitude response as soon as Nancy's condition was relayed. Two experienced workers who had remained at the South Col were prepared with spare oxygen, medical supplies, and enough gear to move back onto the route. One started climbing toward Nancy and her guide, while the second remained ready to follow if conditions allowed, carrying additional oxygen that could be brought higher if contact was made. Radio communication remained intermittent as the wind strengthened above them. The first rescuer continued upward for close to an hour, but visibility deteriorated enough that he was struggling to identify the route ahead, while the wind made exposed sections increasingly dangerous to cross. With darkness approaching and no reliable way to reach Nancy's position safely, the lead guide called the attempt back rather than risk adding another stranded climber to the emergency. The rescuer returned to Camp 4 later that night, while the second worker never received a safe window to move higher. By then, Nancy's guide had his own hands mostly numb inside his gloves, cold deep enough that blood flow had pulled back from his fingers and toes to protect his core. The same basic process behind frostbite in general, the body sacrificing its extremities to keep vital organs warm. It made it hard to even work the clips on the fixed line or hold the radio steady enough to transmit clearly. His last coherent call down to Camp 4 gave their approximate position, confirmed that Nancy could no longer move or respond, and requested any additional help that could still reach them. A call that stayed on record afterward as the final clear account of where things stood before conditions cut off any real communication for a while. With night coming on and his own strength running down, there was a point where staying any longer meant he would not survive it either. Leaving her there was, by every account he gave, afterward, the hardest decision he had ever made on a mountain, one he did not describe with any relief, only with the plain, exhausted honesty of someone who had run out of other options. He made it back down to Camp 4, badly frostbitten on several fingers and toes, and physically depleted in a way that took weeks to recover from. What stayed with him longer than any of that, by his own account afterward, was simply having been the one who was there, and the one who eventually had to leave. Nancy was presumed to have died on the exposed ridge above Camp 4 sometime after her guide was forced to leave, as temperatures continued falling and conditions worsened into the evening. Once the expedition began piecing everything together, her guide's radio logs, oxygen data, and the timestamp on the summit photo helped establish a rough timeline. When he was stable enough to speak, he walked the expedition leader through the bottle changes, ridge congestion, short extension, descent, and the final position where he left her. The records showed how far beyond the target turnaround time she had gone, and how long she remained high on the mountain after losing the ability to move. Exactly when her condition became fatal could not be known. The terrain and conditions made recovering her body too dangerous, so her position was recorded instead. Gear recovered lower on the mountain, and personal items from base camp were later returned to her family. Because Nancy's body was never recovered, there was no autopsy and no way to establish one definitive medical cause of death. The expedition's final account treated her death as a presumed fatal exposure at extreme altitude, with hypothermia, severe exhaustion, and hypoxia all considered likely contributors based on her guide's observations and the conditions where she was last seen.